Hello, everyone,
Alrighty.
and welcome to the show. Welcome to our little YouTube channel, and welcome to Connie McReynolds. And thank you for coming back to the show.
Thank you for having me back.
Well, I had to because you intrigued me with all this good stuff about ADHD, and today we're gonna talk about couples where at least one of them has ADHD. How does that work if you are a hyperactive person? It isn't just about not paying attention. I've been reading there are things that we make promises and we don't really keep them. We might be disorganized, might be that one person becomes the boss of the other person or the parents because one forgets everything. And so
Hmm.
this is a lot more than just personality. This is me. It's really a brain wiring issue. So we're going to talk about it and see how we can retrain the brain to go a little bit deeper, to be a bit calmer, to have the better connection. And I can really prepare because I read the book that Connie has written. This was about kids, but the wiring is the same. And while you will notice that some people you think they are ADHD, they're just teenagers. Once we grow, prefrontal cortex and finally 24, 25 is done and you're still procrastinating, you're still not seeing stuff, or if it's not there, it's out of your mind completely, so you forget. So this has an influence because you might think, my partner doesn't care. He's promised to do it, but yet he hasn't done it. So let's see and let's start. There must be the one thing that you wish that everyone who is a partner with an ADHD person will understood about the brain instead of just making them feel guilty. Well, shall we start with this? What is the one thing that people should know?
That it isn't willful. That if this is going on, the behaviors look willful, neglectful. They look like, that a person isn't paying attention. They look like all these labels that we give this, which is the high conflict area in a lot of relationships. So part of what's happening here is if I can't remember what you're saying to me, and then you expect me to over and over again, and I consistently drop the ball over and over, that becomes what we call a high friction point in a relationship. And it's not just couples. I mean, this happens in friendships too, but particularly in couples where you are together, in whatever manner that is organized in. But if we have this going on, and I'll say it even kind of extends a little bit beyond a person having the diagnosis, because a lot of people don't even have a diagnosis and they have all of this going on and they have no idea what to call it. They just know their relationship isn't where they want it to be. The other person isn't following through, they're not following through, and they feel guilty about it. And when we start getting into those negative kinds of interactions in a relationship, we know that has an impact. So really, it's truly understanding that we're dealing with brain processing. Now, it doesn't mean that sometimes people just don't simply forget because they have too much on their plate. So just because you happen to forget something occasionally doesn't mean you necessarily have a processing problem. However, you may have a processing problem and not know it. And that's kind of the thread through all of this.
Excuse me. Okay. So a lot of people might not realize that their partner or spouse has the issue. So they think, you don't really love me because you forget. And then you
Mhm.
start being accused all the time, then you have resentment. Or I did read that a lot of people who have this ADHD, they take everything as an attack or insult to their character. They take it very personally. So even if you make a comment, that's the
Mhm.
end. So it could be that you end up walking on eggshells.
Yeah.
So you talk about the negative stuff, but is there any positive stuff about having a person who is not all negative, right?
Well, I think it's a fair question because people will talk about their superpowers, and there's nothing wrong with that. So there are people who actually have a lot of energy because of all of this going on. And I just did an intake with a woman yesterday, double masters, two children, one a year old, also works, 40 miles away from where she lives, and just has a lot going on. The trouble is there's a tipping point. So you can have all of these great aspects that you've been able to, what I call kind of create a workaround in your life. You've learned how to work with the strengths that you have, trying to mitigate those areas that where things don't quite go the way you want them to. But like I was talking with her yesterday, I think she was just a great reminder of this. There comes a point where it might start falling apart. In other words, there's so many things going on that the ball starts getting dropped in important areas. And that's what she's struggling with now. You know, the double masters, nursing school, and just the list just went on and on and on, wanting to start her own business. And just, it just, you could feel, you know, that creativity in her, which is a lot of what this can look like and feel like and be very useful. The challenge is, as I've seen it, is that there has to be a balance in there. And if we can't find a balance between the creativity piece and the rest piece, she isn't sleeping, she isn't eating well. So we've got a cascade now that's starting to happen for her. And that's where people, I think, want awareness. It's like, if it's working, great. If everything's going great, you're balancing it all, perfect. You've got it. It's when it starts, there's these old TV shows that you might watch on reruns where they're spinning plates on the end of sticks. And I see how many plates they can get spinning before they all start crashing. Well, when they start crashing, that's the sign. Need to pull back, need to figure out what's going on. And that's when people show up. It's like, okay, I've been able to do this, but I'm now at this point where something isn't working. I'm getting 2 hours of sleep a night. I'm exhausted. I can't get rested. It doesn't matter what I do. And she was a nurse, so she knows her adrenaline levels are high. She knows her cortisol levels are high. She knows she can't lose weight because of the cortisol. So she's still got the baby weight on her that she wants to get off. And it's like, well, all of this is tied together. So we really need to figure out what parts of your brain are processing things properly. But when she talks about trying to remember, now she can't. So she's rereading material over and over again. And she flunked a test recently. And again, all these alarms are starting to go off for her, like, okay, something isn't working anymore. So we're getting ready to do the assessment on her to figure it out. It's like, okay, here are your areas of strength, and here are these other areas that we need to tackle.
And I forgot the beginning of this. Is she aware that she has ADHD?
Yes.
Okay, so there is a point where in our relationships with people or at work, we realize we are burning. So this the end of the stick. I can't visualize it well, but I imagine there is a point where you want to be diagnosed. But does ADHD get any better as we get older, or does it get worse because it becomes a habit? That's a weird question, but I'm very curious.
I think it's a very important question because it can and it might not. What I've noticed, and I'll just wax a little bit into this, I've noticed that recently there's been some interest in the concept of ADHD and menopause. And I'll just drop this one in here, right here, because what's happened is that women in their midlife have actually now started to realize things are not working as well as they need to. So they may not have ever been diagnosed. So girls and women tend to not be diagnosed very often with ADHD. So they kind of get missed in all of this because their symptoms look very different from little boys. So girls in classrooms tend to withdraw. They tend to be quiet. Women tend to just internalize, like it's overwhelmed. I'm not able to do things properly. They internalize all of this. And so when you've got all that going on in a relationship, kind of back to the relationship, then here we are, there's this friction point that's happening, and it just causes difficulties. And so they may have been able to do a really good job of balancing all of this. But maybe now, like this other woman that I was talking about, maybe it's not being balanced quite so much. Some women tend to do better, I think, as we go along because we learn coping strategies. So there's all types of coping strategies that we develop, and we can actually find some of those when we work with people as they have good stamina or they have good processing speed. But it's the big picture. what's happening. So people may or may not be diagnosed with ADHD, and I think that's kind of the difficulty. If you have a diagnosis, there's some pros and cons to that. If you don't have the diagnosis, there's some pros and cons to that. Because sometimes kind of knowing what to call something is helpful. Other times people get stuck in the label, and kind of like what you were saying, everything kind of gets blamed on the ADHD, and people start becoming very sensitive about that.
That makes sense, because then, oh yeah, I can't do this because I have ADHD, and becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, doesn't it? And but we know that there is a way out, and a way not to say, there we go, I no longer have ADHD, but maybe a way to tone down everything, so we are more aware of what's going on. We can see the triggers. We can lower these huge emotional responses, etc., and we can understand what the therapy is doing and how we can bring that into everyday life. I know you use neurofeedback for this as well. Could you give us an example of what happens to an adult person, so 18 plus, who goes through these exercises, which from what I understand are done with some kind of equipment you put on your head, and also you have this ECG waves measured, and then there is a computer and you're acting with this, and this changes our brain. Is that correct, or am I just fantasizing?
Nope. You've captured it. So it's kind of a two-pronged process here that we're looking at. So the front end is this piece of this assessment that takes about 2 hours to get to. And that's where I've actually developed the data analysis software program to dial this into each person. And so for couples, imagine that couples in conflict, they're struggling around these particular issues. Someone's not listening. Someone talks too much. We've kind of got that whole thing going all over the place. So let's say I just love to use this example when I'm out doing presentations. I just did a couple of national ones where I talk about this concept of auditory persistence. So auditory persistence, if you want a definition of this, is how big is your bucket? How much verbal information can you hold? So some people have a very large bucket. So they can be around talkers all day long, and they can absorb it, and they can manage it, and they can do great. There are other people who have a very, very small bucket. And so when someone kind of in their mind drones on and doesn't quite get to the point, they just want the person to stop talking. They just want you to get to the point and don't talk to me anymore. Let me deal with this. And so I can just see the heads across the audience are going, oh, it finally has a name. They're going, oh my gosh, that's what that's called. That's what that is. It's like, yes, it's real. It's absolutely real. So if you're in a relationship where it's a big talker and the other one just needs space, that's natural conflict right off the bat. So if we can figure that out, if you have a big bucket or a small bucket and your partner has a big bucket or a small bucket, right there we can say, okay, person with a small bucket only needs a real small detailed information. Person with a big bucket, you can talk to her all day long. So, or him. So whichever way that goes. So it's really understanding that. And then if we take it to the next level, which a lot of people want to do and just get rid of all of that, then we do the EEG biofeedback, which is called neurofeedback. And so with that, we are simply retraining the brain. We find those areas of weakness. It's like a gym for your brain. We just train that. We do it over a series of 10 to 20 hours of training. It sounds like a lot, but if you think a lifetime of this, it's not very much at all. We get rid of it. So what we're doing is just training the muscles in the brain so that they work better. We can increase memory. We help with comprehension, which is what this woman was talking about yesterday. We find that. And the beauty of that is once we find it, there's something we can do about it. And also the beauty of it is that with the onset, even though COVID caused a lot of difficulties in the world, it actually helped in the development of software where we are now able to work with people and just help identify this. So this is all kind of an educational process for people. So if you can learn about what's working and what isn't working and help your partner understand what you need and how you need it, versus blaming each other or getting frustrated or thinking that there's something wrong personality wise or that your relationship just isn't going to make it. What if it is going to make it once you know the tools in how to communicate more effectively, that it isn't your personality or your partner, but if I can't hang on to what you're telling me, but I'm great if you write it down, send me a text. So I actually had one of our clients call. This has been a few years back. He called me one day. He goes, "You know what? It's working." I said, "Okay, what happened?" And he said, "Well, every day I leave work, every day my wife calls me to go to the grocery store to pick up a bunch of stuff. Every day I would get home and I would have forgotten half of it, and she would be so upset." He said, "Last night she called me. I remembered everything and I got it all home." And he said, "It's working." He said she was the first time she was happy. And we just have story after story of that in couples about if you know what this is, there's something then you can do. And instead of calling him, text him. So just send a list. And that's a really quick remedy for people. But if you don't know that's what's going on, then you tend to kind of place responsibility where it isn't really supposed to land. In other words, it's kind of not what you think it might be. And that's the key to get rid of that frustration in a relationship.
Absolutely. Just imagine thinking, oh, this person really cares because he or she has done what I asked. And then if they don't do it, oh, they don't really care. It's obvious, isn't it? We think, well, oh, he's so busy with work, she's so busy with that. And actually, once we know the root cause, it's just empowering. I think that's the
Yes.
whole thing, isn't it? And whether there will be cases when people absolutely need medication, but once you know what it is and you start changing, there was also a book, the love languages, and I think there should be a
Yeah.
book for the love languages for ADHD people, because for
Hmm.
them it is important to understand there are limitations to maybe
Yeah.
how much information they can dump on people before people they don't
That's
need
right.
to be. I mean, I'm a talker. I just love talking, but also love listening, and I have a very large bucket. In fact, I know that I can cope with Huberman Lab um, science lectures for hours on end, plenty of interest, and I'm all there. Maybe I'm drawing while he's talking because then my fingers are busy. But
Mm-hmm.
that's it. I will just stick there because I really love it. But if it's a very boring lecture and people are faffing around without really going to the point, they're talking about the weather or they're done with a nephew, I'm like, why am I listening to this? You
Hmm.
know, and I think that's a shorter circuit when you have ADHD. It becomes like torture to sit there in a lecture in a school or with a very talkative partner. Like, for example, I have a grandmother who certainly did not have ADHD, but she was very talkative. And my grandfather just learned, he was quiet and just, yes, darling, yes, dear. And that's part of a British culture to have a husband that just quietly goes, yes, dear. He has no idea what she's saying, but he just, da, 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 da. He just had enough of that. And, you know, it's part of being in a couple to understand there are limitations and we're all different. But yeah, when you have a condition and now you know why you have it, what's going on here, what can you do? It's liberating. So if a person wants to go and tackle this, their first step will be to be diagnosed by somebody. Is that correct? Before just jumping to the cure?
Well, I think you do need an understanding of what's going on. Whether that comes with a diagnosis or not doesn't necessarily have to happen because I don't diagnose. So we just get into the root cause. So we are looking at this and we take information. I try and figure out kind of what's happening. And then we have an assessment that takes about an hour to do. It's all computer based. And what we're looking at are these 37 areas of how the brain works with information. We also are looking at something called fine motor hyperactivity, which is different from what we typically think of in the way of hyperactivity, because we typically think of a child who can't sit still or runs around or fidgety or whatever, and that is part of it, but it's not the only thing. So, as I alluded to earlier, girls tend to manifest things much differently. but even boys can do so. So it's possible that even boys who have this going on, it serves more as what I describe it to parents as kind of a little bit of like a white noise machine in your head, but you don't really hear it. So it's an interference pattern that interferes with the brain's ability to take in and absorb what's going on. So it can affect comprehension, it can affect memory. When we find this, certainly with the neurofeedback, we can tackle that. We can help train and strengthen those areas of the brain. But even without the neurofeedback, if you could just have a level playing field. So with the couples, if they each knew what their strengths were, then you have a strategy. And with the process that we use, we do that hours worth of assessment. And from that is going to come an 8 to 10 page report with each one of those 37 areas that's going to give you strategies. So for example, that auditory persistence piece that we talked about. So here's your strategy. What does your partner need? Do they actually need this amount of information, or do they need it in a little more succinct manner? Processing speed is a big one. So some people are very speedy. They can keep up with all kinds of information. Other people, there's a drag. So they hear it, but there's a lag in between what is being said and kind of how they're picking up on it. And that can affect their memory. Then the visual piece of it, there can be disorganization. So one person's neat and tidy, the other person, everything kind of looks jumbled up and messy because they can't quite figure it out. They don't know where everything's supposed to go, and they get completely overwhelmed by looking at the room. They have no idea where they're supposed to start. And when you've got that going on, you just think the person, and we use words. I mean, we use words like lazy and unmotivated, and they can't get their act together and all kinds of things, that it really isn't that at all. If there's visual processing problems, they may not be able to see what you're seeing, not vision, not hearing. But when you can't process it, then that's where the difficulty comes in. So I think back on some of the clients that I've worked with, and I remember we were working with a veteran. He had been married for 20 some years, and he was telling me that he was really struggling. Every day he would come home from work, and his wife would ask him how he was doing. She was interested in his day, and it would infuriate him. He would become so angry and so frustrated that he would stomp off. He was telling me this story. And I said, well, what was going on? And he said, I couldn't stand it. It's like I just couldn't stand all these intrusive questions that she was asking me all the time. I didn't want any of that going on. And I said, well, how long has this been happening? He said, for 20 years. And I thought, that's a long time for her to, I thought, be patient, and for him to be stressed out so badly over this. I mean, he really was just completely agitated about all of it. He couldn't see any reason why she needed to talk to him when he got in and ask him how his day was. Again, just finding it so intrusive and so aggravating. And so what we did was, when we did this assessment, we found that this auditory processing challenges for him were so weak. So everything that he was doing at work was taxing him to the end of his ability to manage. And so at work, there were a lot of interactions that were required. So all day long, he was hanging on kind of like with a thread. And then when he would get home, it was like the dam would burst, because it was like one more thing and he just could not handle it. So once we figured that out, and actually with him, we did the neurofeedback, and he came in one day toward the end of his program, and he said, I just want you to know something. I said, well, what? He said, I got home last night, and he said, my wife asked me how my day was. And he said, I realized after all this time, she was just interested. She was just trying to share time with me. And he said, I wasn't aggravated. And I realize now it was just too much for me to handle when I got home, but it wasn't any malice on her part at all. And he felt pretty bad about all of that. And I said, well, you can talk about that now that you know what that was, now that you know and you can see what that pattern is. And he said, well, I have something else to share. And I was like, well, what's that? And he said, for the first time in 20 years, we just planned a vacation together. And I said, oh, really? And he said, yeah. And he was smiling. And he said, yes, we're going to take a vacation together now. And I said, well, I said, I guess it was all worth it, wasn't it? And he said, yeah, it was. So on that note, I thought, never will I underestimate, the power of these processing difficulties and what can happen in people's lives and the struggle that they can end up with. And I won't also underestimate what it means to people when they're not dealing with that anymore, because it was so powerful that day. It's still, all these days later, I still think of it.
Incredible.
Yeah.
It has such an effect. It isn't just about sitting, not sitting, being restless. It's this emotionally taxing thing of having to cope at work because it's not acceptable. We have to throw stuff. When you get
Mm-hmm.
home, typical of a man, you get home and you take down the helmet and the armor and you're like, I'm not gonna be in the other boxes, all these different boxes we have. Well, the woman is all encompassing everything and she's thinking about everything all the time. So she's like, oh, of course, we're not going to talk about how was your day. And he's like, no, let's put this aside. I had enough.
Mm-hmm.
I can just
Mm-hmm.
imagine if we had hours to talk about many couples, but I'm sure that the audience here is like all ears and thinking, yeah, that's why it's happening with me. Can you believe how many people will not cheat anymore? Not go off in divorce, not close down, maybe stay there in separate rooms, if I understood that maybe in their own case, that's the issue. That's how it is. I'm gonna throw a question that I didn't know I was gonna ask you. Do you
Okay.
think that we are born with this condition, or it can happen to people through trauma and things like that, or it's something that's it, you have it, and until you die?
Well, I've been doing this for 15, 16 years now, and I would say yes to all of the above. So, yes, I think some children, we've worked with children as young as 3 who are struggling. That doesn't mean every 3-year-old is struggling. So, we can't put everyone in a big box here. But we've seen enough of it that in families, there can be families of 4 or 5 children. 4 of them are okay speaking about this. One of them is struggling. In other cases, we've had 3 of 3 children coming in because all 3 of them and the parents were coming in. At one time, we had a family of 5 coming in. Both parents and all 3 kids were struggling with this. So it can be a lot of everything. And I think that's the challenge is I don't know that we can necessarily get to the bottom of why people have this necessarily. I will say that we work with a lot of folks who've come out of trauma situations, and that certainly is an impact on how the brain is processing. That amygdala system, we could probably do an hour just about the amygdala system and what's happened with children with trauma, what happens with adults with trauma. I work with a lot of veterans, so we have a contract with the VA doing both the psychotherapy and the neurofeedback because the veterans are coming home with a lot of challenges. In some cases, when we do kind of a deep dive into it, they may have had things happening before. A lot of them may have already had trauma experiences. So going through the military just exacerbates everything that they're experiencing. So there really isn't, I don't think, one answer. So that's kind of the old nature nurture question. And it's yes to both. And it can be a combination of both.
Yeah, that's interesting. I remember the story of this guy. There was also in your book, I think, that was basically expelled from his school, but actually all it was ADHD. So he was becoming violent
Mm-hmm.
and disruptive because he was so frustrated what's going on. I can't follow. People are calling me lazy. Probably teachers hate me or something, but actually it was a condition. One quick question in the end. I just wanted to know, so there is something in the brain that when we are pregnant is happening to cause this processing disorder. I know you're not a dietitian or a nutritionist, you're not a neuroscientist, but have you heard in the grapevine anything like what's going on. Is there a dietary issue, like, oh, they didn't have folic acid or whatever?
Mhm.
Is there something that is causing me ADHD? Do we have to blame ourselves? Oh my gosh, I was an older mom, so my children all have it. Or is autistic, so he has to have ADHD? I'm just very confusing. Is there something that we can change so that we don't get to cause this problem in the newborn baby?
Well, I think mothers take on so much responsibility and so much worry and guilt when something in their child doesn't seem to be working right. And so I don't know that we have the answers for all of that at this point, because I think there are so many variables in our world. I mean, we know there's just so many variables, temperature, food, chemicals in the food, chemicals in the air. If we kind of go down that, nutrition, supplements, there's so much that I just don't want mothers to take this on that they've done something wrong per se, but certainly good nutrition, good rest, good care during pregnancy, reducing stress as much as possible. But that isn't a possibility for some people. They have very complex lives. So I think the whole thing with a mother thinking that she's caused this, I can't I can't say that that's the case because of the variations that exist in the human condition. We just don't necessarily know, but we do know good self-care is getting in the right direction. We just, there can be exposure, there can be an illness that could not have been predicted. So it's I want people so much to move away from blame and shame and guilt with all of this, because there are just ways forward. What we do gives people hope. It kind of doesn't matter how it got here. What mattered is you got here today. You showed up today. You came today. You have questions. We're looking at this. We're finding, answers for people that they've said they've looked for years or decades and could never get. And when you can get an answer for what this is, something to call it besides a diagnostic label, I think that gets to the root of what people are really needing and wanting. And in some cases, children and adults are able to dial down some of the medications when the brain starts working better, because the anxiety that goes along with that, the stress that goes along with that, the sleep disruptions that happen, we can regulate that. We sometimes will kind of ask people to talk to a nutritionist, pay attention to what you're eating. We know there are certain foods that are plentiful out there that aren't necessarily great for our brains. So, there are things that people drink thinking that they're great drinks to drink to give them a boost. And then they start looking at the chemicals inside and they're going, I didn't know it had all this stuff in it. I had a veteran showing me that the other day. He brought one in. He said, I had no idea. It had a healthy name on the label, and I thought it was healthy.
Oh yeah. Wasn't it
Yeah.
E123, E124, which have been banned in Europe for like 30 years, and lots of them are connected to being more energetic when you need to be, especially as a student. You don't need to jump out of the walls in the bedroom. Okay, in the classroom, and so that would just make it worse, wouldn't it? So
Hmm.
I just want to thank you so much because you have such a calm approach. It's distilling all these signs for us, common peasants. You have no idea about this psychology and stuff, but we want to learn what can we do in the normal day-to-day life, and this is it. You have to understand what's going on, why it's going on, what can we do about it, and then go step by step. Hopefully we're not too disorganized in this because the mind. And then we can always call you. Just a reminder for my listeners, in case you missed the previous episode, which was all about children, the previous one. And Connie is a licensed psychologist and certified rehabilitation counselor, and she has a proven record of how to treat not only ADHD but also anxiety, anger, panic disorder, and depression and PTSD and trauma. So she has quite a good understanding of what's going on. So if you have any questions, you know where to go, to ConnieMcReynolds.com, find out more, and maybe she can be the key for your own happiness. So thank you for being here, Connie. It's been such a pleasure to have you twice.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful being here.
It's been good. You guys, you know what to do now. Subscribe, like, look up any video coming out. I don't know what we're going to come out that have to do with this. And I'll see you all next week. Take care, everyone. Bye.